And this is why the addressing and the correcting of this narrative of slavery is so important. Slavery is not associated with the melanated or black race. It's actually associated with Caucasians. That's a fact. That's what it's named after. These are the people who historically this narrative was attached to. Now, does that leave us in a situation where black people don't have any rights to ask for reparations, to demand for better treatment? The fact that slavery is associated with black people in our modern age, but plays a very, very, very small part in our history, or at least in the history of black and melanated people globally. If you conservatively estimate that we as modern humans have been as we are now for at least, let's say, 250,000 years, I believe is the kind of conservative estimate. If we're going to take the mainstream narrative for what it is, black people were enslaved for 400 years. And I'm going to argue against that, but let's say for 400 years of that time, it actually plays a really minor contribution in regards to our history as a whole. What many of you may have noticed is that I continuously or keep referring to this term slavery as opposed to slavery. And I know it's probably got to the point where some of you are watching the video and you're getting really irritated, like, why does he keep saying slavery? Well, I say slavery because technically slavery is the correct word. Most of you will know that slavery comes from the term Slav, or from the Slavic people. And I'm sure most of you will also know that for a very large part of our modern history, slavery was, I would not say isolated, but certainly concentrated to a specific Eurasian region around the Black Sea. And it was around this region that for thousands of years, this area of the world produced slaves. And you'll notice something. This area was not in Africa. It was not associated with Africa or Africans. And actually, for thousands of years, this area, slap bang in the middle of Eurasia, was the place that was known for producing slaves for the rest of the world.
Michael Ballard states regarding the world's oldest slave trade: however, slavery is an ancient tradition in the Black Sea and cannot be solely imputed to the Western traders of the late Middle Ages. It already flourished in antiquity, as noticed by Strabo, who wrote about the slave traffic in Dioscurius, the main harbour of the Central Caucasus.
Now, this fact, as considerable as it is one that is really highly overlooked by most people. I want to read a few pages for you from this book by Dr. Neil Irvin Painter. It's called The History of White People. And I just want to read a couple of excerpts from this book to give you an idea of why we call the practice slavery and not Africry, for instance. Missing in this analysis is any ambivalence regarding slavery. Although Herodotus mentions slaves repeatedly, he always does so in an offhand, matter-of-fact manner, as merely a system within the common hierarchies of antiquity in Greece, throughout the Greek Empire and among the barbarians across the known world. At least as early as the 7th century BCE, nomadic, loosely organized societies around the Black Sea region established an efficient trade network, furnishing slaves to the wealthy of Greek society. Regions long fabled in myth, such as Thrace, now southern Bulgaria, northeastern Greece, and northwestern Turkey, homeland of the Roman slave Spartacus, and Colchis, now Georgia, in particular, seem to have supplied the bulk of them. Impoverished parents and kidnapping pirates delivered slaves to the market, and famine and warfare regularly increased the supply of people offered up for sale. Could oligarchic Greece have thrived without slavery? Could the philosophers and citizens attending their businesses and that of the state ever have arisen without such a lower class doing the work, Plato owned 50 slaves, and households with 10 or more bondspeople were common. Going about town or on long military campaigns, Athenian gentlemen always took a slave or two. Quite likely, slaves outnumbered free people in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, probably numbering 80,000 to 100,000 in Athens alone. Multitudes of enslaved women worked primarily at household tasks, providing services that could be sexual, medical, and domestic, while male slaves, skilled and unskilled, laboured in the fields, on board ships, and in industrial workshops. Athens used an enslaved Scythian police force, numbering between 300 and 1,000, for Scythians were known as skilled archers. The slave trade worked like this. As noted, the Black Sea line of supply began the barbarian chiefs whose endless warfare steadily drove refugees onto the market,
where chiefs sold them to Greek slave traders for luxury goods,
wine and clothing. Not that war was a prerequisite. Thousands of children also entered the market, having been sold by their parents for salt and other necessities. Two cities, Byzantium, later Constantinople, and then modern Istanbul, and Ephesus, Asia Minor's most important Greek city, dominated the market in slaves. Ephesus is probably best known today as home of the Ephesians of the Bible, whose Christian church was one of 7 in Asia to which St. Paul addresses his letters. Now I'm going to skip ahead a few lines and I'm going to continue reading from here. Whatever the truth of that self-serving story, power relations clearly ruled the day, and the powerful would have their due. According to Herodotus, once again, every 5th year, the Colchians and the peoples around them traditionally paid a tribute to Persia, one of 100 boys and 100 girls. Already well established in Herodotus's time, this levy's origins could not be traced, and it must have continued long past the days of Herodotus. For more than 300 years later, the Greek historian Polybius, 203 to 120 BC, notes the Black Sea origins of life's everyday necessities, cattle and slaves. Indeed, the slaves from the Black Sea region, of people later considered white, continued for more than 2,000 years, ending only with Ottoman modernization at the turn of the 20th century. Such was the lot of masses of Europeans in ancient Greece.
Felicia Rosu asserts regarding the age of slaving in the Black Sea. So far, the Black Sea has been virtually absent from this discussion, even though the region constituted one of the main slaving hubs on the frontier between Europe and the rest of the world from the ancient period to the 19th century.
Now, it's important to note that this practice of slavery, dating back thousands of years, didn't stop until the Ottomans, who had become empowered by many of the people who had previously or descended from those enslaved groups, decided to shut off the Black Sea. And this kind of happened in several steps. Firstly, in the 18th century, the Ottomans faced increasing naval pressure from Russian forces, and then following that in the 19th century, they completely ended the Caucasian slave trade in 1857, following a treaty with the British. Now, all of this happened behind the backdrop of the Barbary corsairs essentially scouring the coastlines of Europe during the 17th and 18th century due to the decreasing supply of slaves that was coming from the Black Sea region. So because it was becoming increasingly harder to get those Caucasian slaves, they were essentially just kidnapping slaves off the coastline of Europe. Now that I've given you a partial insight into the Caucasian slave trade, the one thing that I haven't touched on, and probably I'm not going to touch on in any detail in this video, is the enslavement of mainland Europeans. And I'm talking about Western Europeans by the Barbary corsairs. And this is a slave trade that took place contemporaneously, and in many cases you could argue predating the transatlantic slave trade. Without me going into too much detail, I'm just going to read a few words from you from Giles Milton's book White Gold to give you a bit of an insight in terms of what this looked like. Sir Sidney and his knights drew attention to a trade that had ensnared at least 1 million Europeans and Americans over the previous 3 centuries. The largest concentration of white slaves had always been in Algiers. The city had a continuous population of about 25,000 captives, between the years of 1550 and 1730, and there were occasions that the number had almost doubled. During the same period, some 7,500 men, women and children had been held in Tunis and Tripoli. The number of slaves in Moulay, Ishmael's imperial capital, was more difficult to ascertain, even though the conditions in which they were held were better documented than elsewhere in North Africa. The 5,000 captives reported by European padres were contested by Ahmed Ez-Zayani, who claimed that the real figure was at least 5 times higher. Although North Africa's slave population had fallen to 3,000 by the time of Congress of Vienna, Sir Sidney knew that this was a recent development. He was also aware that snapshot statistics told only part of the story. The number of slaves shipped to North Africa each year was always dependent on the rate at which they died, apostatized, or gained their freedom. Dysentery, the plague, and forced labour killed thousands, requiring the corsairs to put to sea in search of replacement captives. The ransom of slaves also played its part in sustaining the flow. For 2 centuries, perhaps 3, there had been an influx to Barbary of almost 5,000 white slaves each year. So bear in mind that 5,000 has already been contested, could be about 5 times the amount, and this is each year for 3 centuries. And this is Western European slaves, not the white slaves taken from the Black Sea and the Eastern European region. This is a completely different contribution towards that number. So you can see there's this massive trade of white people into Northern Africa and other parts of the world, whilst there's this alleged exclusively black African slave trade taking place. You can see there's something going on here in terms of the dialogue that we've been given. Let me continue. So this is now in response to a petition to raid these, to raid Barbary, essentially. Lord Castlereagh, I'm sure I'm reading that wrong. Lord Castlereagh was stung by these criticisms. He had been forceful in advocating the abolition of the black slave trade. Now he vowed to end the trade in white slaves as well. In the summer of 1816, that's 9 years after the end of the the end of the slave trade, but I'm going to say that in inverted commas, he persuaded the British government to dispatch a large fleet to the Mediterranean. Its goal was to compel the rulers of Barbary to stop seizing and selling European captives. There was to be no debate, no payment of bribes, and absolutely no concession. If force must be resorted to, read the British government's lofty statement of intent, we have the consolation of knowing that we fight in the sacred cause of humanity. So I think you kind of get the picture there. Over a period of 300 years, aside from the Black Sea slave trade that we've already been discussing, there was an entirely different Western European slave trade that was taking place, in which the Barbary corsairs made a habit of capturing slaves from all along the coastal regions of Europe. And by the way, they call it capturing, but there is lots of evidence that the Barbary corsairs traded with Europeans who were quite happy in some cases to sell out their own, sell villages, etc., etc. All of the tropes that are given about Africa.
Michael Ballard states regarding the nature of slave acquisition: parents sold their young children or adolescents to save them from dearth and famine, especially after 1350, when the need for native labour grew in the West. For example, in 1360, 3 Tatar slaves were sold to Florentine merchants, a girl of 13 years old by her brother, another one by her uncle, and a young boy of 14 years by his parents. The sale of children by their parents seems to have been normal on the Caucasus shore.
And these people were sold into North Africa. And you can see the numbers there were quite massive. We were talking about anything between 5,000 and 25,000 slaves from Western Europe captured every year for a period of 300 years. So we're talking about very astronomical numbers that number well into the millions if you count them cumulatively. Now, what's quite interesting is when it comes to the demographics of Northern Africa, everybody treats the pale or the light skin as the default or as the native indigenous expression of phenotype. In reality, we have evidence, substantial evidence, that all of that light skin contribution is likely a callback or indication of descent from some kind of slavery, be it the Barbary Corsairs version of slavery or the Caucasian slash Circassian slash Mamluk slave trades, which have brought in millions into that region over the past few millennia. So there's substantial reason to believe that all of those different ethnic blends you get in North Africa were heavily influenced by this trade of slaves from Europe into Africa. Not quite the direction you probably initially were thinking about when it came to this discussion.
Hannah Barker states, the greatest demand for slaves in the medieval Mediterranean was concentrated not in Italy, but in Cairo, home of the Mamluk Sultan and his emirs, the commanders of his army. The Mamluks preferred Black Sea slaves for military service. Within this diverse population of slaves, those from the Black Sea were the single largest group.
Now here's something that you might find even more interesting. I recently had a conversation with an expert in North African and Arabian history, Professor Dana Marniche. She has written several peer-reviewed articles regarding the subject, and she has actually educated a number of PhDs and other educated people in the subject of the demographics of Northern Africans throughout history. And she is of the impression that the treatment of Europeans towards Africans might have a karmic element to it, i.e. they could have essentially been responding to these several centuries slash millennia of mistreatment as being treated like slaves by the Africans. Now, I'm not going to say whether or not I agree with this outlook, but I'm going to say it's very interesting to consider. Now, I'm going to play you a bit of footage so you can hear it from the horse's mouth.
Or them being made into slaves. Yeah, but a lot of this is karmic, I have to say. I mean, a lot of it, what was going on with the the black people across, these countries, they were in millions of Europeans for ages as well. I mean, if you look at what the Tuareg were doing, the Romans said that the Tuareg, especially with the women, apparently they like the European women, we're taking the Roman we're taking the Roman women from the Levant and, making hybrids across North Africa. That's what Claudian said in his book about the Nasamonian Berbers. Okay, the Tuareg is still, one of the clans of the Tuareg is still called Kel Inusamani. That's where the name Nasamon comes from. Of course, up until during the time of sultans in Morocco, they were taking tens of thousands of slaves, European slaves, into the cities, like I said, of Meknes and other towns. So I guess one of the karmic retributions was not to have a history anymore.
That's an interesting perspective. Very interesting perspective.
If you look at it, I mean, because if you go back, it looks like every place that now other people have said it was theirs was actually originally black, especially when it comes to the Bible or the Torah.
Now, one thing that I know for sure is that many people who are hearing me share these perspectives on slavery are going to be instantly resistant to it. They're going to be instantly resistant because they've always been taught another narrative when it comes to slavery. And they've got this idea perhaps that what I'm doing is undermining the suffering of black people, melanated people globally who have suffered from this practice. Let me make this very, very clear. That is not the intention of me sharing this message, and that is not the picture I'm trying to paint. But the one thing that I am trying to make clear is that the only people that have benefited from the transfer of the slavery narrative being placed solely onto black and melanated people is the system of white racism that created it in the first place. There is a reason why white supremacy and white racism doesn't talk about white slavery. There is a reason why you haven't been taught, and I was not taught in school, about the 3,000 years of the Caucasian slave trade.
Toledano asserts regarding the treatment of slaves throughout history. From early sapiens societies on, enslaved people were not considered as fully human. that enabled extreme, though rarely total, domination, violence, coercion, physical and sexual exploitation, and unfreedom. Yet, for the enslaver to be able to extract labor and services, the enslaved had to be kept alive and exploitable, physically and emotionally. This passage highlights the deeper psychological effect of the enslaved group accepting an enslaved status, contemporaneously or historically, which ultimately results in their exploitation by those who occupy the role as enslaver.
There's a reason why people assume when they see black people throughout history in different settings and different circumstances, everyone goes, this was a descendant of a slave. This emperor was a slave who rose to prominence. This king was a slave who rose to prominence. Every time they look like they're black or mixed, you see a mixed race monarch in Europe. His mum was a slave. His dad was a slave. It's entirely ridiculous. If there was someone who should be considered a slave, let's take, for instance, Rome had numerous North African rulers. Now, many of them will present as being either mixed, sometimes phenotypically black, and everybody, or at least the Western narrative that we're given, is that this was a slave who rose to prominence. And yet when they present as white in North Africa, no one assumes that they're a descendant of a Caucasian slave trade. No one assumes that they're the descendant of a Caucasian slave trade or a Black Sea slave trade.
Sergei Karpov states, Russian slaves were identified by Venetian notaries in general terms as slaves of Slavic origin. Michael Ballard continues, as such they fully fit the label of slaves, which is the translation of the word sklavus, the only one used by the notaries. Finally, Felicia Rosu reminds us, the Black Sea has been one of the main slaving hubs on the frontier between Europe and the rest of the world from the ancient period to the 19th century.
Everyone just assumes that that's what North Africans look like, even though anthropologically we know this is not the case. We know that Africa is a black continent, as a continent filled with black people, and any incursions of people who are of European or Caucasian descent can be easily explained, not difficultly, but easily explained by the substantial slave trade that has been taking place for the last 2 to 3 millennia in that region. I hope that video has been informative to you. Please do make sure that you're subscribed if you're on here and you enjoyed this discussion. Make sure that you've hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. Also, I need to inform you that I am writing, or I'm in the process of completing a book called Reconstructing Egypt. The pre-sale is going to be open shortly, and if you're interested in that, please do make sure that you click on the provided link in the description, which will tell you how you can participate and get yourself an early copy. I've got lots of really cool perks available, and obviously I want everybody, or at least as many people as possible, to read this, so there's going to be very affordable digital versions of the book available for those of you who want to support. I also have a Patreon, and you could become a channel member if you wish to support the research that I'm doing. But I would just like to thank you for taking the time to watch this.